Witnesses are testifying on the third day of Sam Bankman-Fried's criminal fraud trial.
That's right. The founder of the crypto exchange FTX denies charges that he stole billions of dollars from customers for his own use. He faces 7 counts of fraud and conspiracy charges. That includes 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit money laundering.
CBS News legal analyst Rikki Klieman joins us now. Rikki, some of his former coworkers are expected to testify against him. How important is their testimony to the prosecution?
Their testimony is the most important because these are the people who were involved with him on a day-to-day basis in running FTX, the exchange, as well as dealing with the company called Alameda Research, where it is alleged by the prosecution that the money was siphoned out of the exchange, the money that belonged to people who were regular investors and customers, and it was moved over to Alameda Research so that it became the personal piggy bank of Sam Bankman-Fried. Remember, at this point, that's an allegation, not a fact.
You know, a lot has been made by the defense's opening statement in acknowledging that he didn't have a risk compliance officer. He was just too busy. He wasn't really attached to it. How important will testimony be from his closest confidants on this question of how competent he was to have the role that he had?
Well, if he's incompetent, if he's sloppy, if he's scattered, that certainly does not equal criminal intent to steal and defraud. So that really is where the defense is. The defense is saying these facts may be true, but this was not a bad guy. This was not a criminal. This was not someone who went out to steal and use other people's money. Now, Sam Bankman-Fried presents as someone who is distracted most of the time. However, being distracted is not simply enough to walk out of the courtroom. What's going to happen with, in particular, the 3 witnesses who are right in the thick of it all, as well as the witness who is testifying now, which would make 4. You have one immunized who's testifying now. He's someone who left the firm. He resigned as soon as he saw the trouble, as soon as he saw writing on the wall. The other 3 remained, and the other 3 are people who were deeply involved in the day-to-day operations. So what Sam Bankman's defense is going to be is to try to cast blame on these other 3, and in particular on the prosecution's star witness, and that's Caroline Ellison. She was the person who was managing Alameda Research. So if you look at it from the prosecution's point of view, it was good to give these people plea deals. It was worthy of giving them something in order for them to testify on behalf of the government to show that Sam Bankman-Fried was a thief, that he was evil, that he intentionally defrauded all these people who entrusted him with billions of dollars. And in the end, it's the defense's opportunity to try to sow reasonable doubt and say, wait a minute, these 3 witnesses who got these deals, they are testifying to the prosecutor's tune. They are going to say things that make the prosecutor happy. It doesn't mean that they can say that Sam Bankman-Fried intended to defraud.
Oh, Rikki, if convicted, Bankman-Fried faces up to 110 years in prison. Do you think that it's likely he's going to spend the rest of his life behind bars?
The magnitude of this theft is going to make the federal sentencing guidelines go up. What happens in a case, if there is a conviction, is in terms of sentencing, the probation office will have to come up with the appropriate calculation to advise the judge of what the guidelines say. And the guidelines are written in terms of months. So these would be astronomical amounts of months in order to get to a sentence that is decades upon decades in prison. The amount of money that is found by the Office of Probation, as well as the judge, of course, and will be argued if there's a conviction on behalf of both the defendant and the prosecution. Both sides will argue what the appropriate guidelines are. that may mean, as you compare it to other cases, what did other people get? So is this 5 years, 10 years, or is this 50 years? And we're really not going to know until the very end of the trial.
All right. Rikki Klieman, thank you.